Hi, Jeff Shapiro, politics columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, filling in for politics editor Andrew Kane, who is away. Here today, to my left, David Ress, a politics and government reporter for the Times-Dispatch, and to my right, Charlotte Renee Woods, a politics and government reporter for the Times-Dispatch. We are at the procedural midpoint of the General Assembly session, crossover in the argot of the legislature. There is a good deal standing. There's a good deal that's not. And all of this is a reminder of Virginia's divided legislature, a Senate controlled by Democrats, a House controlled by Republicans. It's not a mix, particularly in an election year, for a particularly productive legislative year. And one of the issues on which this division is most pronounced, David Ress, is the state budget. These are actually amendments, tweaks to an existing budget.
It all comes back to the budget.
Amendments to an existing budget, and they're in response to amendments to the existing budget from Governor Glenn Youngkin. And the House and Senate are roughly $1 billion apart, which means we're going to face a couple of really difficult weeks ahead, because it's not just the money, it's kind of a philosophy thing. The House is backing a series of tax cuts that Governor Youngkin has proposed.
And these are top tax cuts that the governor won last year.
Mm-hmm. Yep, which are $4 billion. The Senate says that's money that we really need to put into public services, particularly education. So they're really far apart. Speaker Todd Gilbert in the House took this unusual step. You know, as with crossover, when you're supposed to, one body's supposed to finish up its stuff, send it over to the other body, vice versa. There's a lot of kind of formality and procedure in the General Assembly. And one of the procedures happens with the budget, it happens with other bills too, is when they're widely apart, you have this dance. Your House bill goes over to the Senate simply slaps its bill on in replacement, sends it back to the House, vice versa.
Pro forma.
Pro forma. And then you have this thing where, oh, we reject, no, we insist. Well, let's have a conference to negotiate the differences. Speaker Gilbert is worried enough about the ticking clock. We got 2 weeks roughly to go, and $1 billion difference. And he's saying, let's cut short the formalities. They're very nice, they're very traditional, but let's get going. I'm going to name my conferees, my negotiators, and they're ready to get going this weekend. If you are from the Senate, haven't heard back from the Senate yet, but I think it's a sign when you've got a guy like Gilbert, basically worried. It's a sign we're going to face some difficult times.
And I guess it's not entirely impossible. In fact, it seems to be standard operating procedure these days that the legislative session, because of the budget differences, could go into overtime.
Yeah, that infamous legislative clock that runs or legislative day that runs for more than 24 hours. I don't think they're going to head for a special session. And one incentive for actually doing a deal is we actually have a 2-year budget in place. We also have a surplus. And we have legislators who will have ideas that they want to do about where money should go. If they don't act, then that means that the decisions get made by the next legislature after an election, which they may, any particular legislator may or may not make it through. So there's an incentive to do something.
And one would note that the tax cuts, the tax relief that the administration is pushing would include another increase in the standard deduction, that sort of basic calculus that goes into figuring one's taxes. But much more controversial is a reduction in the corporate income tax rate. The Democrats view, and there are actually a good number of Republicans who will say privately they're not hearing a great hue and cry by the corpocracy to cut taxes.
No, I think that's going to be the main moving piece here. That particularly in the House, Democrats are kind of out of it because they're the minority in the House. They were emphasizing really strongly two things that I think are really significant. One is they were, in the debate this week, hitting hard on the corporate tax at a time of high corporate profits, in an apparently indifferent response to the business community. And they were proposing increases for particularly K-12 education that were not as dramatic as what the Senate Democrats did, and were much closer to what the lost revenue from the corporate tax would be. So that's clearly going to be where a lot of the action is going to be.
Charlotte, there'll be action as well over, or maybe measured by inaction,
A blend.
over the evolution or lack thereof of the cannabis market. You know, Virginia has taken steps, certainly to not just to legalize private use of cannabis, but to kind of capture this emerging market. Why are we still at an impasse on this?
It's very nuanced because the legalization of cannabis and setting up a legal market, it's not just a medical thing or a business thing or a criminal justice thing. It's all of these things. So that's why there's still lingering questions that need to be resolved. There's an appetite for it because when, a few years ago, Virginia legalized medical marijuana, those dispensaries are now already operating in the state. And the intent when decriminalizing possession a couple of years ago was to set up a market by 2024. That may not happen this session, but there are still some bills moving that cleared the Senate that are now going into the House. One of them is a very niche one that got bipartisan support. It passed 31-9 in the Senate, and it would basically say in custody battles, you aren't considered abusing or neglecting your child if you possess marijuana. So that's like a more niche specific one-off, but there's a lot of broad bills like concerning setting up the market. And one of the big questions that remains is, how much of a head start should these larger pharmaceutical companies and medical places have because they're already working in this related space versus...
And they're guaranteed markets.
Yeah, versus, smaller businesses and people who have been from disenfranchised communities wanting to get into this industry. So there's some back and forth on like, how do we make this a more broad market for people to get into? And then also, some bills have come up to look at resentencing for, if someone's serving time on a cannabis conviction, should they be able to have their sentence reviewed and shortened or taken away because now it's technically a future legal market and thing? So there's definitely back and forth on that. To be a little punny, it's like Governor Glenn Youngkin's a little bit hazy on what he's going to support. And then, so we'll find out if things get to his desk. And then slightly related, but also a tangent, is this back and forth over Delta-8, which is the chemical found within also hemp and cannabis plants that this is a synthetic chemical that can also create the similar like euphoria or high or calm that usually cannabis can produce. It's not regulated. It is sold in head shops, grocery stores, gas stations around the state. And, there had been an uptick in calls to poison control centers from people accidentally getting more high than they intended, or children because a lot of the packaging looks like, candy and snacks, but it's special candy. Then you've got children getting into it, and that was seen as like a risk. So there's also legislation looking at, how can we have regulations on packaging and sales of these so people know, it comes down to consumer protection, so you know what you're getting when you're consuming a product.
Speaking of getting high, if I may put it that way, we have both sides also expressing elevated concerns about abortion restrictions, but also controls on firearms. And we saw this week that House Republicans did with gun control legislation what Senate Democrats did with abortion restriction
There's definitely some of that partisan bickering that's a little bit higher above the, in my reporting I try to stay focused on like the policies and the issues, but there's always the fun bickering back and forth that happens. So there's definitely some contention there among different legislators on how to conduct committee meetings, how to make sure that people can actually testify to the merits or opposition of bills before they're voted on.
Yeah, bills dying without much discussion.
Right. People really want to have their say. They want to say, please vote for this, or they want to say, please vote against this. And so there's been some hiccups on that happening on that front. But also worth noting that guns and abortions, which it's the never-ending topic that I feel like I will probably always cover, because there's always movement, but then it stops in both of those issues. You'll recall in 2018 there were like 70 gun bills that went through and only one actually passed. And so here we're seeing a lot of abortion restriction, protection, bans, and similar things with firearms on access restrictions, storage, substantial risk orders. We're seeing all these kinds of bills be explored and examined, and I just don't know if we're going to get much traction.
Yeah, and it's a footnote, being an election year, a lot of this stuff qualifies essentially as a brochure bill or two, not likely to succeed in the body opposite, but at least having gotten it in the record,
It tells
a
your
candidate
voters that
can
you're
try.
trying.
Oh, so, for example, the constitutional amendment affirming abortion rights.
You know, a factor that kind of exacerbates that too is we have a lot of legislators, both parties, including this time unusually the Democrats, who are facing primary challenges, and those start happening, especially because of early voting, really soon after the session adjourns.
And
same
we've got
day.
these new districts, so
And on early voting, now that was the Republicans would like to cut it to 14 days. The Democrats are standing by 45. The impasse means that 45 days stands.
Yeah.
David, another business issue, maybe not generating as much interest as, say, reinstating some of the regulatory authority of the Corporation Commission, the state's corporate cops over the utility industry. What I guess in our shorthand we've described as son of payday loans. What's going on with these wage advances that are being pushed by a single company at this point?
They're being pushed by a single company. One of the things that we have another situation rather like Dominion, where we had two bills that started out the same. One body, in this case the Senate, not the House, gutted the bill. The services are they're apparently in Virginia. They're sort of obscure. They contend they are not actually loans of any kind, to say nothing of a payday loan.
Simply advances on one's earned
On what you've
wages.
already earned.
Okay.
The political problem which emerged on the Senate side is that the sponsor on the Senate side was a Senate Democrat,
Who works in the credit card business, I believe.
but also from the peninsula, my home turf. And one of the things about the peninsula is, for goodness, the 30 years that I've been hanging around, what they call predatory lending, high interest rate loans that target people who really don't have the access to banks, has been something that politicians have made their cause célèbre for forever.
Yeah, there's an intersection in Newport News where there was one on each corner, as I
Oh
recall.
yeah. And it's I think it goes back to like Phil Hamilton. I mean, it was in the 90s. People were fighting on this. So when you had State Senator Monty Mason, who is in a really competitive district now, carrying this bill, apparently not really understanding or seeing the depth of concern and the range of opinions about this approach. It ended up being a really dangerous situation politically for November for a legislator who will probably have a tough fight.
So maybe he's off the hook or somewhat protected because it looks like, if, at minimum or at most, there will be
Yeah.
a study of this off-season.
That's the way it's going, and probably also not just for political reasons. There's legitimacy to it. This is a complicated new area. The argument that do you mess with something really complicated, a business regulation in a 45-day session, when no one really quite understands what this bill is, and there is in the background a company in New York State from a few years back that was really effectively abusing enough vulnerable people that the state of New York pursued it, got a settlement.
And the wrap here is that we're talking about a habit, if you will, that draws people back into the so-called debt
Exactly.
trap. This is what we're hearing
Exactly,
from,
yeah.
from
Just
consumer
goes over and
protection
over,
groups.
yeah.
Also, we've had some scuffles over political appointments. Democrats using their slender majority in the state Senate to torpedo some Youngkin political appointees. First off, Colin Green, the health commissioner, he's been labeled a model of racial and cultural insensitivity. Another casualty, Stephen Buck, a former prosecutor from around these parts, was removed from the parole commission because he seemed to do everything but grant people who were eligible for it parole. But one survivor, Bert Ellis, a multi-gazillionaire, by the way, one would note the son of a late lobbyist, to the UVA board.
I still lived in Charlottesville when that drama first emerged. I guess he became controversial for a few reasons. One was during 2020, he was offended by something that a UVA student had written on her door, or their door. I can't remember who it
I
was.
think it was a barnyard epithet.
And so he showed up on campus with a razor blade to scratch it off, and definitely caused a kerfuffle in the Charlottesville community. And certainly, and then also Cavalier Daily, which is the student newspaper at UVA, unearthed, because he's a UVA alum, which is why he was considered for this appointment, unearthed that when he was involved with student groups at UVA, he invited a eugenicist to speak at an event. And UVA used to send eugenics data to Nazi Germany, so there's a lot of history there. And so there were definitely people who said, well, he should be unfit to be appointed, but a lot of people saying, well, look at all the other things that he has done that make him a good fit.
And his deep pockets.
Ultimately, the Democratic-controlled Senate, where you could have suspected that his appointment would have been smushed, 2 senators actually ended up siding with Republicans.
Yes, it was initially smushed and then unsmushed. And speaking of smushing, we're smushing the clock. This is Jeff Shapiro along with Charlotte Renee Woods and David Ress. Thank you for joining us, and keep up with developments out of the General Assembly online at timesdispatch.com. And I think all of us are on Twitter and social media, so follow us there as well. Have a wonderful weekend.